You may have heard your dad talk about his favorite rock bands when he was a kid and how much they influenced him when he was younger. And while it may seem kind of out of touch, considering rock isn't really a mainstream genre right now, those bands actually influenced a lot of people, not just the people who listen to them, but society as a whole back then and now. We don't really think about how much rock music has impacted such little things like the way we dress or the way we act or think about subjects such as sex or drugs. And rock bands have really paved the way for a lot of us to be able to think differently or to act differently. So you may have heard of the phrase sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Maybe once or twice in your life, probably from someone who's in their 40s or 50s. And although it may seem like a silly cliche, the same stems from a lifestyle that many rock musicians from today, as well as way back in the 60s, have actually lived and experienced. But these musicians weren't the only ones to be affected by these crazy drug lifestyles. Their fans also took a very big part in them. During the 60s, the lifestyles of celebrities really began to be showcased in mass media because of, overbearing press. It was kind of a new thing to find out how your favorite celebrities were doing in the private lives of their own homes. So many rock musicians and rock bands started to show their recreational use of drugs. This caused many of their fans to also turn to drugs because of a want to be like their favorite idols, mixed with the idea that the music would probably sound better while on drugs. According to The Conversation, musicians have used drugs to enhance creativity, and listeners have used drugs to heighten the pleasure created by music. The two riff off of each other endlessly. So one of the biggest examples of this is in the late 60s when the Beatles, who were previously seen as kind of a wholesome band, kind of meant for kids, a group of really nice boys, started to experiment with LSD and became very public about it and acknowledged it, and many of their fans followed. Rock music and fashion have also been linked for many years. Musicians have been setting trends for their fans and for just kind of everyone as a whole since all the way back to the 50s and the 60s. In the 50s, many musicians would dress very professionally performing, wearing suits and ties, dressing almost like how they would dress to go to work. But when the 60s began, many artists started dressing more casually in jeans and normal clothes. Musicians could be seen sporting bright colors, flared pants, and fun accessories that were different and unique. This was largely due to the counterculture revolution with the hippies. According to Loudwire, it was a flamboyant statement against the dapper looks the artists had years prior. In the early 70s, glam rock became very popularized in mainstream, which showcased a lot of glitter, high heels, dramatic makeup. And then in the 80s, heavy metal bands became very popular, and they had very strong images, kind of like bad boy images, with lots of leather and denim and spikes and studs and very long hair. In the early 90s, grunge brought kind of a punk-inspired, much more minimalistic look compared to past decades. It featured, torn jeans, flannels, and just kind of a more casual way of performing than a lot of artists had seen back in the 70s and the 80s. As well as being very fashionably involved, rock bands also tended to be very politically and socially involved. They tended to be a voice for the voiceless, and they felt the need to fight for things that they thought needed to be changed. So according to Britannica, rock remains one of the most democratic of mass media, the only one in which voices from the margins of society can still be heard and loud. So in the early 60s and 70s, love and peace were very big themes in rock music, and during the Vietnam War, many rock protest songs were released against the war because it was not love and peace, it was violence and murder. So rock activism really reached a high point in 1985 with Live Aid, which was where famous musicians would perform at a concert for the famine in Africa. And anybody performed at Live Aid. It was mostly rock and pop musicians, and they had 2 stages, one in London and one in Philadelphia. It lasted 16 hours and it generated millions of dollars. It was televised worldwide, and it has really been a model for musical fundraisers. So although rock music isn't necessarily mainstream anymore, its stories and influences live on and are very much present in our current society.